The sun hung low over the town of Brookwood, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts of Main Street. The cicadas buzzed like an alarm that wouldn't shut off, and the summer heat pressed down on the town like a heavy blanket. People moved slowly, like figures melting in the haze of late July. Eleanor Grace Washington walked steadily along the sidewalk, her brown paper grocery bag tucked firmly under one arm, a bouquet of greens poking from the top. At 78, she carried herself with a quiet dignity, her silver curls tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, her long dress fluttering softly with each step. Her brown skin bore the marks of age and wisdom, but her eyes were sharp, clear, and kind. She moved with purpose, not just because of the heat, but because she'd promised herself she'd get home before the sun dipped too low. She passed the bakery where she used to buy fresh rolls for her late husband, the church where she'd sung gospel for decades, the barbershop where folks still remembered her as Mama Ellie, even if many of the younger ones had no idea who she really was. But just 2 blocks from her modest little home, a police cruiser rolled slowly down the street beside her. It wasn't unusual. In Brookwood, patrols were regular, too regular in some neighborhoods. Eleanor noticed the car out of the corner of her eye and kept walking. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. She had done nothing wrong. The cruiser stopped. "Hey," came a voice through the window. "You, stop right there." Eleanor turned, startled. A tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out of the vehicle. His uniform was crisp, his badge shining, his nameplate read T.R. Doyle. His face was hardened, unreadable. His eyes narrowed as he approached her like a wolf circling its prey. "I'm just on my way home," Eleanor said calmly, even as her fingers clutched the paper bag tighter. "What's in the bag?" he snapped. "Groceries," she said, holding it up slightly. Doyle's eyes flicked over her, not seeing a tired elderly woman, but someone suspicious. Someone who didn't belong. "Got some reports of suspicious activity around here," he said. "You match the description." Eleanor's brow furrowed. "I match the description? Of what? An old lady picking up tomatoes and spinach from the farmer's market?" "Don't get smart," Doyle said. "I need to check your bag." "There's no need," Eleanor began. But he stepped forward and snatched it from her hands. The bag tore open slightly as he forced it open, sending a few potatoes tumbling to the ground. "Is this how you treat all grandmothers in Brookwood?" Eleanor asked, her voice edged with fire now. He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed her arm roughly. "I need to see some ID." "You don't have the right to touch me," she said firmly, trying to pull away. That's when he shoved her. Not hard, but enough. She fell, her hip hitting the concrete, the edge of the curb scraping her elbow. Her hat flew off. Her breath left her chest in a rush. Across the street, a boy on a bicycle stopped. He lifted his phone. Eleanor didn't cry out. She simply stared up at the man who had pushed her. Not with anger, not with fear, but with a gaze so calm, so damning, that even Thomas Doyle seemed momentarily shaken. "You'll regret this," she said, voice quiet but steady. "Not because I'll do anything, but because truth always comes home." Doyle scoffed and turned away. But the boy's phone was still recording. And Brookwood was about to change. By morning, the video had exploded across the internet. The headline on social media read, "Cop pushes elderly black woman to the ground over suspicion." It had over 1 million views by noon. And hashtags like #Justice for Mama Ellie and #Brookwood Bias began trending nationwide. Local news vans rolled into Brookwood before lunchtime, lining up outside the hospital where Eleanor was being treated. Protesters started to gather in front of the police department, some holding signs that read, "Our elders deserve better," others simply standing in silence, tears in their eyes. But inside the Brookwood Police Department, things were different. Officer Thomas Doyle sat at his desk, arms crossed, watching the video on a loop. His jaw tightened each time Eleanor's calm voice played back, "You'll regret this." He didn't believe he had done anything wrong. He was doing his job, following protocol. People were blowing this out of proportion. What was she even doing there? He muttered. Just wandering around houses. Captain Morris, a veteran of the department, stood at the door, arms folded. She was walking home. "Doyle, that's all." Thomas didn't answer. He hated being questioned, hated being made the villain. Meanwhile, at Brookwood General, Eleanor lay in a hospital bed with a bandage on her forehead and her arm in a cast. The nurse adjusted her pillow gently. "You got visitors, Miss Washington," the nurse said softly. Eleanor nodded, and a young black woman stepped in, a reporter from Atlanta. She asked for an interview. But Eleanor smiled and declined. "I'm not ready to talk," she said, but soon. Outside, a group of children left flowers on the hospital steps. One girl, no more than 10, left a note scrawled in crayons. "You are strong. We love you, Miss Ellie." That night, the mayor of Brookwood issued a short statement calling the incident concerning. The police department placed Officer Doyle on temporary administrative leave, pending further review. But the people weren't satisfied. They didn't want administrative leave. They wanted justice. Hundreds of miles away, in a high-rise government building in Washington, D.C., a man sat frozen in front of a laptop. His name was Gabriel Nathaniel Washington, and he was the Secretary of the Interior of the United States, a powerful and respected figure. His career had been shaped by integrity, discipline, and, above all, silence. Gabriel had always avoided speaking about his personal life. He kept his origins, his family, and especially his mother out of the spotlight. But now, there she was, sprawled on the sidewalk in a viral video. The woman who had raised him. The woman who had kept the lights on with 2 jobs and still found time to teach him to pray. The woman who called him Nate when no one else dared. And she had been assaulted in broad daylight. Gabriel's hands clenched into fists as he watched the video again and again. His chief of staff, Jake Foster, stood awkwardly nearby. "I had to show you, sir," Jake said gently. "We've already got 50 reporters asking if that's your mother." Gabriel didn't answer right away. "Yes," he said finally. "That's her." Jake nodded. "I can release a statement. Something non-committal. Or I can say she's just a resident of Brookwood." "No," Gabriel said. "Say nothing yet. I'm going to Brookwood." Jake blinked. "Sir, with respect, that could be. I'm going," Gabriel said again, his voice low and immovable. "Book the jet. Tonight." He looked out the window at the Capitol dome, lit against the evening sky. "All my life I've served this country," he whispered, more to himself than to Jake. "But now, I owe someone far more than politics." Brookwood had never seen a black SUV with government plates glide down its dusty streets so silently before. But that's exactly what happened just before dawn. When Gabriel Washington arrived, not as a cabinet secretary, but as a son. He didn't tell anyone who he was. Wore jeans and a simple dark coat. He walked through the side entrance of the hospital, passed by confused nurses, and entered room 312 quietly. Eleanor was awake, sipping weak tea. She looked up, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she smiled. "I wondered how long it'd take you," she said. Gabriel crossed the room and knelt by her bedside. "Mama, I'm sorry I wasn't here. You had the whole country to look after," she said. "But this time, it's personal." He nodded, eyes shining. "They didn't know who you were," he whispered. "They never do," she replied. "And that's the problem." He looked down, then back up. "I want to expose him. I want to expose all of them." Eleanor touched his hand. "No, son," she said. "I want you to do what's right. Not what's loud. We don't need revenge. We need truth." Gabriel swallowed hard. "I'll make sure the world knows who you are, Mama." Eleanor looked at him with a faint smile. "No," she said. "Make sure they know who they are." Outside the room, the storm was gathering. But inside, a mother and son were quietly preparing for war. The next morning, the Brookwood Police Department was a storm of quiet chaos. The walls were thin, and the tension thicker than the Georgia heat outside. Phones rang with calls from journalists, activists, and angry citizens. Interns carried stacks of papers that no one wanted to sign. The usual smug jokes in the bullpen had vanished, replaced by furtive glances and stiff silences. Officer Thomas Doyle sat at his desk, back rigid, hands folded in front of him as if he were still on duty. Though his badge had already been surrendered for temporary administrative leave. He didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't even blink when Chief Raymond Hardin walked into the room. "Doyle," Hardin said, voice clipped, eyes bloodshot. "My office." The blinds were already drawn. The door shut firmly behind them. Thomas sat down slowly, hands on his thighs, refusing to meet the chief's eyes. "We're putting you on leave until this investigation wraps," Hardin said. Thomas nodded. "Expected that." The chief leaned forward. You have any idea how bad this looks? You assaulted an elderly woman. A harmless woman. A black woman. In broad daylight. She was acting suspicious. She was carrying groceries. I had reports. There were break-ins on that street last month. God damn it. Doyle. The chief stood up and walked to the window. You know what I hate more than anything? Not the media. Not the protesters. It's when one of my own does something stupid enough to burn the whole house down. Thomas clenched his jaw. I followed protocol. Hardin turned around. Slowly. Protocol doesn't involve shoving an old lady to the ground and searching her like she's some crack dealer. This wasn't about protocol. This was about your gut. And your gut is rotten. Thomas stood abruptly. You're hanging me out to dry. No, Hardin said, his voice icy now. You did that to yourself. The door opened. An officer from Internal Affairs entered and handed Thomas a suspension document. Doyle stared at the paper. Then at the chief. Then walked out without a word. But his fists were clenched so tightly. His knuckles were white. In the hallway, whispers followed him like smoke. Coworkers who once shared coffee now stared at their screens. His name was no longer a badge, it was a threat. And deep down, for the first time, Thomas Doyle felt something foreign. Not guilt, not remorse. Fear. Eleanor sat by the hospital window, watching the trees sway under the early evening breeze. The sun was still golden, stretching long fingers of light across the tiled floor. She'd been discharged earlier that afternoon, but the doctors had insisted on observation for a few more days due to her age and risk factors. She was tired, bone-deep tired, not just from the fall, not from the cast around her arm, but from the weight of it all, of having to endure again. At 78, Eleanor had lived through enough cruelty to last 100 lifetimes. But somehow, it still found her. Gabriel had gone to make some quiet phone calls. But the room didn't feel empty without him. His presence lingered, like sunlight long after the lamp has been turned off. Her mind drifted to the past. She remembered being 13 in Montgomery, when her father had been dragged out of church by men in white hoods because he spoke of voting rights. She remembered her mother weeping silently. No sound, just rocking back and forth on the porch swing. She remembered being 19 and refused service at a diner, even though she wore her Sunday best. She remembered the day her husband was beaten by officers who mistook him for a suspect just because he was jogging in a white neighborhood. She had survived it all, not with vengeance, but with grace, because that's how she had taught Gabriel, not to rise with fists, but with fire inside the heart, to build instead of burn. But now, as she looked down at the bruises blooming on her skin, she wondered whether grace had ever been enough. There was a soft knock on the door. "May I come in?" asked a voice, female, soft but professional. Eleanor turned her head. A woman in a beige trench coat stood at the doorway. Badge in hand. Detective Rosa Martinez. Internal Affairs. "I'm conducting an independent review of the incident." Eleanor studied her carefully. Hispanic. Mid-30s. Calm eyes. She gave a small nod. "You may," Eleanor said. Rosa stepped inside and sat near the bed. She didn't open her notebook. "Not yet. I want to apologize," Rosa said quietly. "For what happened. You didn't deserve that. None of this should have happened." Eleanor smiled gently. "I've lived long enough to know what should happen doesn't always happen. And what shouldn't, usually finds its way." "I've seen the video," Rosa said, "but I need to understand everything, not just what happened that afternoon, but how long this has been going on." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "You mean Doyle?" "I mean the whole department," Rosa replied. "There are other complaints, others who never spoke up. I need to build something solid, and I believe you're the cornerstone." Eleanor looked out the window again. "I'll help you," she said, after a long silence. "Not because I need revenge, but because I have grandchildren. And I don't want them to inherit this same damn fight." Detective Rosa Martinez returned to her office late that night. Her mind buzzing. She sat in the dim light, sifting through old case files. Some yellowed with age, others freshly stamped, closed, no further action. She began to build a pattern, subtle, insidious. Doyle's name popped up again and again. Always in the background. Minor complaints, unnecessary force, rude language, intimidation. Never enough to trigger an official reprimand. Always explained away. But there was one file that made her stop breathing for a moment. A case from 7 years ago. A 17-year-old black teenager named Marcus Talley, Found dead in a river after being chased by police. Official cause: accidental drowning. Doyle was the last officer reported to see him alive. Rosa leaned back in her chair. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a sickness. The next morning, she met with an ex-officer named Malcolm Green, a man who had resigned 3 years prior after blowing the whistle on internal racism. He looked older than his age, eyes sunken with regret. "You're asking about Doyle?" Malcolm said, lighting a cigarette with shaking fingers. "That man's been bad news since the day he put on the badge." "Why didn't anyone stop him?" "They didn't want to. You don't rattle the system unless you want to get crushed. I tried. I got frozen out." "Do you have proof?" "I got copies of complaints. Some officers gave statements, but the chief? The mayor? They buried them." "Will you testify?" Malcolm looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. "Yeah," he said, "I've stayed silent long enough." And in that moment, Rosa knew the fire was coming. Gabriel stood in the foyer of the house where he'd grown up. The paint on the porch rails was peeling. The screen door creaked like it always had. It wasn't much, but it had always been home. He stepped inside, breathing in the scent of lemon polish and old books. He had returned quietly, without escort, without press. Only Jake Foster knew he was here. And Jake had strict orders to keep the press at bay. Gabriel walked into the living room and sat in his father's old armchair. He remembered nights reading there as a boy. The way his mother would sit beside him, humming softly. So much had changed. He had changed. Yet the town, the neighborhood, it hadn't. And maybe that was the problem. Later that evening, he met with Rosa in a secluded corner of the hospital's cafeteria. They spoke in hushed tones over cups of weak coffee. "I have enough to open an internal case," Rosa said, "but I need public pressure. Political weight. And a name." Gabriel stared into his coffee. "You want me to go public?" "I want the truth to go public," she corrected. He looked up. "For years, I've stayed silent to protect her. To protect our family from becoming a target." "She already was a target," Rosa said gently. "Now she's also a symbol. You can either let this die quietly, or make sure it never happens again." Gabriel closed his eyes. He saw his mother's bruised arm, her blood on the sidewalk. Then he nodded. "Prepare your case, detective," he said, "and I'll prepare the country." The sun had barely begun to rise when Gabriel returned to the hospital. Slipping into his mother's room while the halls were still quiet and the town was still asleep. Eleanor sat up in bed, awake, her eyes as clear and steady as they had been the day he left for college all those years ago. "I know that look," she said, barely smiling. "You're planning something." Gabriel pulled a chair closer and sat beside her, placing a folder on the table. "Rosa Martinez is building a case. A strong one. Testimonies, complaints, old case files, even a potential wrongful death connected to Doyle. But she needs this to be public. She needs me to stop hiding." Eleanor looked down at her hands. The skin wrinkled and bruised but still capable of warmth. "You've never been one to hide. Son, you've just been careful." Gabriel sighed. "And being careful hasn't protected you." She reached out and gently placed her hand over his. "Being visible won't protect me either, Gabriel, but it might protect someone else." They sat in silence for a long time. Then, almost as if on cue, the door creaked open. Officer Thomas Doyle stepped into the room. He wore no uniform now, only a department-issued windbreaker over his civilian clothes. His eyes flicked between mother and son. There was no recognition, not yet, just the same authority-laced tension he carried like a weapon. "Ms. Washington," he said stiffly, "I was asked to come, to apologize." Gabriel stood. Eleanor's voice stopped him before he took a step. "Let him speak." Thomas cleared his throat. "I didn't mean for things to escalate the way they did. I was responding to reports. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time." Gabriel took a step forward. "Wrong place?" It was her neighborhood. Thomas's eyes narrowed slightly. "Sir, this is between me and the lady." "No," Gabriel said, his voice low and dangerous now. "It's between you and every damn person you've ever targeted, shoved, humiliated, or ignored. And that includes her." Eleanor's calm voice sliced through the tension. "Thomas, do you know who I am?" Doyle blinked. "Ma'am, I'm Eleanor Grace Washington," she said, "and I raised the man standing beside you." There was a flicker of realization in Doyle's face, a small twitch in the jaw. Gabriel stepped closer. "You assaulted the mother of a U.S. cabinet secretary." That's who she is. Silence. The weight of it heavier than any accusation. Thomas turned, silent, and left the room without another word. And in that moment, Gabriel knew something had shifted. Not just in Doyle. In Brookwood, the game was no longer in the shadows. It had just stepped into the light. The press conference was brief. Mayor Richard Towns stood behind a row of microphones at City Hall, flanked by tight-lipped aides and a stoic Chief Hardin. The cameras clicked and flickered as Towns stepped forward, lips pursed as though forced to eat something bitter. "We acknowledge the recent incident involving Officer Thomas Doyle and Ms. Eleanor Washington," he began. "After reviewing preliminary reports, the city has placed Officer Doyle on unpaid administrative leave pending a full investigation." His voice was carefully rehearsed, but not sincere. He paused for effect. "We regret any distress caused to Ms. Washington or her family." That was it. No mention of misconduct, no condemnation, just regret, like a grocery bag torn in the parking lot. Not an elderly woman thrown to the ground. Reporters surged forward. "Is it true that Ms. Washington is the mother of Secretary Gabriel Washington? What measures are being taken to prevent further racial profiling in Brookwood? Why has the officer not been arrested?" Towns raised a hand. No further questions at this time. As he turned to leave, a single voice rose above the noise. "She's not just his mother." A young woman shouted, "She's our mother." It was a protester outside the building, holding a sign that read, "Dignity has no expiration date." The crowd roared. By that evening, hundreds had gathered outside the police department, their voices rising in chants, some holding candles, others holding cell phones to livestream the vigil. Inside, Chief Hardin watched the growing sea of protesters through the blinds. "Sir," his aide said nervously, "you may want to cancel tomorrow's town hall." "No," Hardin muttered, rubbing his temples. "Let them speak. If we keep running, we'll drown in silence." But Mayor Towns had other plans. Behind closed doors, he met with senior officers, pushing to contain the situation, not resolve it. "We need the heat off us," he snapped. "Get her to settle. Offer money. Push the narrative. Play the respectability card." But Brookwood wasn't buying what he was selling anymore. The apology had come, late, hollow, and empty. The storm was still gathering. And this time, it had names, faces, and fire behind it. The town hall building had never seen such a crowd. People packed every aisle, filled every row, spilling out into the hallway and courtyard. The air was thick with unease. Elderly folks clutched rosaries. Teenagers wore hoodies with fists printed across their chests. Teachers, nurses, janitors, students, all there, waiting for someone to finally speak the truth. At the front sat Mayor Towns, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Chief Hardin sat beside him, arms folded, jaw clenched. Rosa Martinez sat in the third row with a folder on her lap and a recorder in her bag. Then the back doors opened. Gabriel walked in. He didn't wear a suit or a flag pin, just a navy blue shirt, sleeves rolled, and a quiet fire in his step. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Some people gasped. Mayor Towns stood up quickly. "Mr. Secretary, this is highly irregular. I'm not here in an official capacity," Gabriel said, his voice calm but resonant. "I'm here as a son, a citizen, a black man." He turned to the crowd. "My mother was thrown to the ground by a man in uniform. In the town I grew up in. On a street where she watched me take my first steps." Murmurs spread across the room. Some people wiped their eyes. This is not just about one officer. It's about a culture that allows silence to speak louder than screams. It's about every time someone said, "She must have done something wrong." Every time someone looked the other way. Mayor Towns interrupted. "Now let's not generalize. We're here to listen to all sides." Gabriel turned to him. "Then start listening. You've spent years asking for our votes, our taxes, our labor, but not our pain." A woman stood up. "My son was stopped by that officer 3 times in 1 month. A man followed. He pulled a gun on me when I was late for work and running. Another. He pushed my daughter's boyfriend. No report was ever filed." Voices rose like a wave. The truth could no longer be contained. Rosa stood up, raising her folder. "I have documentation. 17 complaints against Officer Doyle. All buried, all ignored, and one death that was never properly investigated." Gasps, shouts. The mayor banged his gavel. "Order, order." But order had already been lost, not because of chaos, but because of clarity. Brookwood was no longer afraid to speak. And now, those in power were the ones afraid of listening. That night, Rosa worked late in her office. The evidence was growing by the hour: sworn statements, old emails, video footage, whistleblower testimony. She felt the full weight of it pressing down on her shoulders. But she also felt momentum, something rare in cases like these. She stared at a file in front of her. Marcus Talley, age 17, deceased. She called his mother. Mrs. Talley, she said softly when the voice answered. My name is Detective Martinez. I believe your son didn't drown. I believe he was chased. I believe it was covered up. There was a long silence. Then a sob. I knew it, the woman whispered. God help me. I knew it. Rosa scheduled a meeting. The next day, she walked into the evidence room and requested body cam footage from 2016, footage that had supposedly been corrupted. But someone had mislabeled a backup drive. She found it. A chase. A scuffle. A voice. Doyle's voice. Keep running, punk. You're just another street rat. Then static. But it was enough. Enough to reopen the case. Enough to charge Doyle with misconduct and negligence, and perhaps more. Enough to put the department itself under federal review. She made the call to Gabriel that evening. I have it, she said, the first real nail in the coffin. And on the other end of the line, Gabriel whispered only 3 words. Then it's time. The old wooden desk in Eleanor's hospital room had been rolled in by a nurse who still remembered that Miss Ellie liked to write by hand. It had a soft green pad, a silver fountain pen, and a stack of thick, cream-colored paper. There was something dignified about it, even in this sterile room, with the hum of machines and the occasional beeping echoing down the hallway. Eleanor sat upright, dressed in a simple blue robe, her arm in a sling but steady enough to hold a pen. The cast was white, the bruises beneath it yellowing with time, but none of that hurt as much as the weight she carried in her heart. She dipped the pen in ink and began to write. My dearest Gabriel, if you're reading this, I suppose I never had the courage to say these words out loud. You were born into a world that I feared, a world that didn't see you as the bright-eyed, curious boy who asked about the stars, but as a threat. That fear has shaped much of my life. It's why I worked double shifts. Why I told you to come home before dark. Why I prayed louder on nights you stayed out too long. I told myself silence was protection. That invisibility could be a kind of shield. But now I know, silence isn't safety. It's surrender. Eleanor paused, blinking away tears. Her hand trembled slightly, not from age, but from the gravity of what she was finally saying. What happened to me was not just about me. It was about the system you fought from the inside. I raised you to believe in change, in justice, in decency, and you have made me proud beyond measure. But I need you to know, I am proud of who I am too. Proud to be the daughter of field workers, the wife of a man who sang freedom songs, the mother of a secretary. Yes, but first and always, a black woman in America who never stopped believing in tomorrow. If I don't make it through this storm, promise me one thing. Don't stop. Don't get tired. Don't become the thing we're fighting. Speak loudly. Speak truth. And if they try to bury you in silence, remember, seeds grow in dirt. She stared at the last line for a long moment, then folded the letter slowly, sealed it, and placed it in the drawer beside her bed. It was a letter meant for someday. But history was already unfolding in the present. Gabriel Washington stood at the podium inside the press briefing room of the Department of the Interior. The room was unusually quiet. Rows of reporters, TV crews, camera operators, and federal staffers sat with pens poised, recorders humming softly, all waiting. For days, speculation had mounted. Was it true? Was the elderly woman in the viral video really the mother of a cabinet secretary? And if so, why the silence? Gabriel adjusted the microphone. No flag behind him, no seal, just him. My name is Gabriel Washington. I serve as the Secretary of the Interior. But today I'm speaking as something far more important, a son. He let that hang in the air. The woman in that video is my mother, Eleanor Grace Washington. She raised me in Brookwood, Georgia, in a house that barely passed inspection but overflowed with love. She taught me the value of justice, not just in policy, but in life. He inhaled sharply. She was assaulted by a man wearing a badge. A man whose duty was to serve and protect. And while the physical injuries are healing, the insult, the humiliation, the violation of her dignity, that pain is harder to mend. He paused again, allowing the emotion to settle. This is not a political issue. This is a moral one. My family has chosen not to pursue civil charges at this time. Not because we forgive or forget, but because we believe in structural change. And that change must begin now. Flash bulbs went off like lightning bugs in a jar. I am formally requesting a federal investigation into the Brookwood Police Department, he said, including a review of all misconduct complaints over the past 10 years. We cannot heal as a nation if we continue to ignore the wounds in our own backyard. Questions erupted. Mr. Secretary, are you calling for the resignation of the mayor of Brookwood? Will Officer Doyle face federal charges? What message do you want to send to communities who feel the system has failed them? Gabriel raised his hand gently. To those communities, he said, I say this: we hear you. We see you. And we are not done fighting. The arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, but only if we pull. He stepped down, walked past the lights and wires and cameras. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was performing. He felt like he was finally speaking. Outside Brookwood's City Hall, a sea of bodies filled the square. People came from neighboring towns, other states, even major cities. Some had signs. Justice for Eleanor. Others brought flowers, candles, drums. What began as a local protest had swelled into something national. A stage had been built by volunteers. Local leaders spoke throughout the day. Students recited poems. Choirs sang freedom songs passed down from the civil rights movement. Cameras panned across a multiracial crowd, unified by a single demand: truth. In the center, standing before the crowd, was Rosa Martinez. She wore a plain black suit. No badge on display, but her voice rang out clear. I was born in a neighborhood where people disappeared during police stops. Where children learned how to survive a traffic stop before they learned algebra. I joined the force because I wanted to change that. And for a while, I thought maybe I could. She held up the file. This is the truth they tried to bury. This contains 17 complaints against Officer Doyle. This file includes body cam audio connected to the death of a boy named Marcus Talley. This is not about one bad apple. This is about a tree that's rotting from the inside. Cheers erupted. Some wept. Others held each other. We don't want vengeance, Rosa said. We want accountability. And if the system can't give us that, we will build a new one. The crowd chanted her name. Later that night, she met Gabriel on the edge of the crowd. They didn't speak for a while. Just stood side by side, watching the city try to shed its silence. I think this is bigger than us now, Rosa finally said. Gabriel nodded. It always was. Back inside the Brookwood Police Department, Chief Hardin sat alone in his office. The blinds shut tight. The world outside had turned against him. His phone rang every few minutes. The governor's office, the Justice Department, journalists, lawyers, each call more damning than the last. A knock. It was Officer Lyle, the youngest on the force, holding a USB drive. I found something, he said quietly. In the archives. Hardin hesitated, then took it. He plugged it in. The screen lit up with time-stamped footage. One file was labeled, Doyle, March 2019, Interrogation Room B. Hardin clicked it. There was Doyle, standing over a handcuffed man, shouting, cursing, pressing his finger into the man's chest. No lawyer, no witness, no body cam that day, or so they'd claimed. Another file. December 2015, Marcus Talley. A still photo showed Marcus, handcuffed, crying, the last image taken before his death. Hardin sat back. It was all there. Everything he'd ignored, everything he'd denied, everything that could destroy not just Doyle, but the entire department, and perhaps himself. He picked up the phone. For the first time in decades, his voice shook. Get me the Attorney General, he said. I'm ready to talk. And as he hung up, outside, the bells of Brookwood's church began to ring. It wasn't Sunday, but maybe, finally, it was a new day. The courtroom in downtown Atlanta was old. Its walls lined with faded portraits of judges from another century, all white, all male. The past hung in the air like cobwebs, a silent reminder of what had always been and what had yet to be undone. But on this day, the seats were full. Not with aristocrats or corporate attorneys, but with mothers, students, janitors, activists, clergy, and kids in hoodies. Some had driven from Brookwood, others from as far as Chicago or DC. All of them had come for one reason: to witness a moment that felt like history in the making. At the center of the courtroom sat Thomas Doyle, in a charcoal suit that did nothing to soften the tension in his shoulders or the ice in his eyes. He looked straight ahead, as if denying the world could somehow will it away. Across from him, seated with quiet composure, was Eleanor Grace Washington. She wore a deep purple dress, her arm still stiff in its sling, and a white rose pinned to her chest. She did not look at Doyle. She didn't need to. When her name was called to the witness stand, the entire room rose in reverent silence. She moved slowly but steadily, each step a testimony in itself. As she was sworn in, she didn't waver. "I understand you were the victim of a use of force incident on July 3rd of this year." The attorney began. "I was," Eleanor said. "Can you describe what happened?" Eleanor took a long breath. Then she told the story, not as a victim, but as a witness. She described the heat of the pavement, the slam of the officer's hand on her arm, the potatoes rolling on the sidewalk, the way her chest had tightened not from fear, but from exhaustion. Exhaustion of always having to prove her innocence for simply existing. "Did the officer apologize to you?" Eleanor looked at Doyle. Finally, her gaze didn't tremble. "He offered something he called an apology," she said, "but it was more like an excuse wrapped in resentment." Laughter bubbled from the back of the room but was quickly silenced. The prosecutor nodded. "And how did it make you feel?" Eleanor turned back toward the judge. "Like I was 13 again. Being told I couldn't sit at the front of the bus. Like I was 31 again. Being told my husband was mistaken for someone dangerous. Like I was invisible. Or worse, like I was unseen on purpose." She paused. "But I'm not invisible. And I'm not done." Silence fell again, heavy and sacred. Thomas Doyle was next to speak. His lawyer advised him not to testify, but his pride pushed him to the stand. His defense was cold, clinical. He referenced protocols, suspicious behavior, training gaps. He did not apologize. Not really. But the contrast between his testimony and Eleanor's truth was stark. Even the judge could feel it. When the gavel fell to adjourn for the day, everyone in the room knew. The verdict had already been written in the hearts of those watching. And this time, the system had no choice but to listen. The decision came on a Tuesday morning under gray skies, the kind that made even the courthouse look somber. People lined the steps as if awaiting a concert, huddled under umbrellas, eyes fixed on the doors. Inside, the judge entered, robe swishing, face unreadable. "In the matter of People versus Officer Thomas R. Doyle," he said, "this court finds the defendant guilty on the counts of official misconduct, aggravated assault, and civil rights violations." Gasps and murmurs erupted. The judge raised his hand. "Sentencing will follow." Doyle's face remained stone. The prosecutor rose. "Your Honor, given the severity of the conduct and the broader harm done to the public trust, the state recommends a sentence of 5 years with eligibility for parole after 3. The defense objected, citing a clean record prior to this incident. But the judge was unmoved. "Officer Doyle," he said, "you were entrusted with power. You abused it, not once, but repeatedly. The evidence shows a pattern of behavior rooted not just in poor judgment, but in prejudice. This court cannot overlook that." He handed down the sentence, 5 years in federal prison. Outside, the crowd did not cheer. They stood in silence, a kind of reverence, a kind of mourning for the years that had passed in silence, for the names never spoken in courtrooms, for the children who never got justice. Eleanor, seated in the front row, closed her eyes, not in triumph, but in peace. For the first time in decades, she could finally breathe. In the weeks that followed, Brookwood changed in ways big and small. The police department came under federal supervision. An external oversight board was formed, and Chief Hardin announced his early retirement with a trembling voice and a tear-stained statement. The town began hosting community forums, led by Rosa Martinez, now promoted to head of internal investigations. Youth groups formed to teach teenagers how to advocate for themselves and others. Churches opened their doors not just for worship, but for healing circles, town discussions, and strategy meetings. Gabriel returned to D.C., but not quietly. He used his platform to call for nationwide police reform, citing Brookwood as both a cautionary tale and a beacon of potential. Eleanor, meanwhile, returned to her garden. Her small backyard, overgrown with tomatoes and herbs, became a sanctuary again. Neighbors came by just to sit with her, sip iced tea, or ask her to tell the story one more time. She always did, but she never made herself the hero. The people, she would say, they're the ones who changed this town. I just reminded them what they already knew. A mural was painted on the side of the library. It showed Eleanor, standing tall in her purple dress, a child beside her holding a flower. Behind her, faded but visible, were dozens of faces, young, old, black, brown, white, standing in solidarity. The mural was titled, "We See You." One evening, as the sun set in gold across her porch, Gabriel sat beside his mother. "You know they offered to name the new civic center after you?" he said with a grin. "I don't need my name on a building," she replied. "I just want to know they'll fill it with purpose." "You think we did enough?" She looked at him, smile soft but certain. "No, but we started." A year later, Eleanor stood before a packed auditorium in Washington, D.C., accepting the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She wore the same purple dress. Her sling was long gone, but the memory of pain and survival remained. Gabriel stood behind her, his face unreadable but eyes glassy with pride. The president shook her hand and stepped back as Eleanor approached the microphone. "I was not born into a world that promised justice," she said. "I was born into one that made me beg for it, whisper for it, hope for it." She looked around the room. "But I learned that hope is not a whisper. It's a roar, and sometimes, it's a quiet hand holding another in the dark." She paused, her voice trembling now. "I don't accept this medal for myself. I accept it for Marcus Talley. For every mother who buried a child and never got to testify. For the tired, the unseen, the disrespected, and the unbroken." She took a breath. "We have work left to do. But I've seen the power of a community that refuses to look away. And I believe, with all my heart, that tomorrow will be better than yesterday." The room erupted in a standing ovation. That night, as she returned home, she found a letter waiting on her porch, unsigned. No return address. Inside was a simple note, written in careful script. "You taught me what justice really means. Thank you, M.T." She clutched it to her chest, tears falling silently. Outside, the street lamps glowed brighter than usual. And above her home in Brookwood, for the first time in a long while, the night felt warm. The light, once hidden, now burned in every window. And it would never fade again.